Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Ponce de León, and I co-direct the Critical Theory Workshop with Gabriel Rockhill. And we are really thrilled to be joined today by Professor William I. Robinson for an online discussion of his book, The Global Police State, which was recently published by Pluto Press, and also about his work more generally. After briefly introducing Dr. Robinson, Gabriel and I will run a discussion with him for approximately 1 hour. During that time, if you have specific questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. After we go through our questions with Dr. Robinson, we'll be able to address those questions. We would just ask that you don't clog the chat with a lot of other remarks unless they are things, directly related to William's work, just so it's easier for us to keep track of the questions. And then we'll select questions and open up the conversation to our audience. So Dr. William I. Robinson is professor of sociology, global studies, and Latin American studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His many award-winning books include, most recently, in addition to The Global Police State, Into the Tempest, Essays on the New Global Capitalism and the Crisis of Humanity, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2014, and Latin America and Global Capitalism. He is, quite simply, one of the world's leading theorists, and he provides a remarkably compelling account of the global political economy. We are honored to be able to discuss the global police state. While revealing the structural roots of 21st century fascism, this book demonstrates how the increasing inequality produced by global capitalism, including the treatment of entire segments of the population as surplus humanity, calls forth increasing repression, while repression itself has become an ever more central engine of capitalist accumulation. Now, before beginning, I also wanted to mention that the Critical Theory Workshop summer program in Paris as well as online will be announced soon. We are also planning other events in the near future, so please stay tuned and don't hesitate to sign up on our website for our mailing list or to follow us on social media. So welcome, Dr. Robinson. Thank you very much for being with us today. So before jumping into speaking about your book, I wanted to ask you a broader question about your methodology. Could you speak about your methodology, including the thinkers and intellectual traditions that you draw on and the analytical frameworks you employ, and also explain why this offers greater explanatory power than other approaches, particularly when it comes to understanding contemporary capitalism?
Sure. Well, of course, that's an enormous question, right? We can spend a whole hour and a half and more talking about that. But I'm fundamentally a political economist. And for me, political economy is our intellectual, theoretical, and political weapon in the first instance in order to critique capitalism, well, in this case, capitalism, but critique any social order. So I start anything I do, whether it's going to be a specific discussion of capitalism or some other political process or current event, but I always start with, at least in my mind, if not in what I actually write, with political economy, and particularly that means focusing on the movement of capitalism, what's going on with capitalism at any given moment, and what are the underlying dynamics and the underlying logic of capitalism, and especially the ceaseless accumulation of capital, and how that accumulation process changes and shifts and brings us to different political, economic, ideological, cultural links with all of those different levels. Also, I mean, my methodology is fundamentally grounded in historical materialism, which can't get much more elegant as a basic statement of how we start to talk about any human society. How do we produce and reproduce our very existence, our life? But I mean, those are really, really broad frameworks, sort of even beginning to think in terms of methodology. But more hands-on is, the question of how do we then apply that? And what I think that means, and I'll add something else here, dialectics. And what I mean by dialectics is we want to constantly focus on flux and on change, how everything is changing. We want to focus on where are the contradictions, in this case in global society, in capitalism structurally, but also in all of these political and social battles ranging around us. How do we understand that in terms of contradictions? And within those contradictions, for me, what's been really central for all of my research and my political activity is constantly focusing on and emphasizing the centrality of modes of domination and modes of resistance, and how they face up with one another, and how they drive forward the historic process, drive forward how capitalism develops, drive forward if there's going to be a police state or something else, and so forth. And of course, while we're on the same subject, the totality we're taught in our universities, and capitalist intellectual thinking and epistemologies don't teach us to think about the totality. So we think about the totality, the first thing we want to see is how everything is related to everything else, how dynamics in one area, police repression in the United States, a coup in Bolivia, whatever it is linked at so many of other levels to everything else. And so we think about these relationships and how they drive forward whatever we're looking at. And then I don't know how much detail you want me to go into, because again, I can talk about this the whole hour and a half. But then there's the issue of mediations in methodology, right? And the acknowledgement that there's all of these different levels, and what we're looking at, depending on what we're looking at, what we want to explain academically or what we want to think about politically is going to involve a focus on a certain level, but that level involves all of these mediations with the other levels. Let me just expand this out a bit to mention some of the works that have most influenced me, and also to maybe suggest how this methodology is so powerful in explaining one single event. And I mention this one event because I just finished another article and sent it off on this, or one particular circumstance. But obviously, I'm a Marxist, and I'm proudly so. And I know we'll get into the conversation later on the political moment and how central it is to retake Marx's critique of capitalism in order to critique capitalism so that we can intervene in this political moment. But within the very broadly within Marxist theory and approaches, Gramsci is the one that's most profoundly influenced me. But also, I came of age a little older. So, I came of age in an earlier generation when actually Marxism was very popular, and really the center of world Marxism was the third world, the anti-colonial and the anti-imperialist struggles. So I've also been very influenced by what we used to call the third world Marxists, which were all political agents as well. Bernard Magubane from South Africa, Walter Rodney, he was from Guyana, but it was involved way beyond his borders, Amílcar Cabral, and then Mariátegui. All of these had a very formative influence on me in my Marxism. Then I would say more recently and more academically, David Harvey had a very important influence on my own Marxism, but particularly my understanding of crisis. And you know that I've turned since 2008 to really focusing almost full time on one or another dimension of the global crisis, the crisis of global capitalism. So he was very influential on my understanding of Marxism and crisis. There's another school which is not very well, less known in the United States, and not particularly popular at this time. It simply sort of faded out a bit, but social structures of accumulation school. And the reason that was so important for me, and not all of the people that take that approach are Marxist, but it's pretty much Marxist oriented, is that again, it looks at all of these different levels of reality and can take any hands-on issue we want to explain intellectually or intervene in and engage with politically. And it links them to all of these different levels and the particular moments in history. Specifically with globalization, which has been a big focus, but of course I have a particular take on globalization. Manuel Castells has certainly influenced my thinking deeply. I haven't heard from him in the last 15 years or so, but his trilogy on the network society, despite the fact that there's a lot of things in there that's not Marxist, I think were very, very influential for me. Saskia Sassen's work on global cities was quite a turning point, because there's a brilliant exposition of how we also rethink about space, capitalism, and what that means for our social struggles. Excuse me. And then I was very close with a school in international relations theory known as the Neo-Gramscian school. Of course, that comes out of my own Gramscianism. I mean, I can go on and on, but one of the things again about a dynamic, non-dogmatic very, very flexible Marxism, historical materialism, political economy, is that we can look at so many different things, whatever it is. And I think that's, if I would suggest this for anyone, that we want to, even if we have a particular area in our discipline, and then within our discipline, a particular area we focus on, we want to read incredibly broadly about anything and everything going on in society in every sub area, even if it's not our specialization. So I learned, just for instance, a tremendous amount from Eleanor Leacock. She passed away. She was an anthropologist that did really pioneering work on class, modes of production, and women and gender. But just to give an example, I'm not an expert on women and gender, but part of my methodology is to cast a very wide net in what I focus on. I guess I would just conclude, what you're asking by also very broad and very deep history. I find the study of global world history incredibly liberating, because it allows us to move away from particulars, and it allows us to see the general in the particular, and then go back to the particular of whatever we're studying. So, I mean, those are a few comments on my methodological approach. I hope that's useful.
Absolutely.
I just conclude by saying no one should be scared of challenging orthodoxies, whether Marxist orthodoxies or whatever they are.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I thought that one way of kind of getting into the most recent book, The Global Police State, would be to start by framing it in relationship to some of your earlier work. And in particular, I was struck when reading the book by the relationship to your book promoting polyarchy, which came out in the late 1990s. And so I wanted to ask you if you could just briefly explain the core of your argument in that book, which has to do with how since the 1970s, the United States has been globally promoting polyarchy, and that this was a new kind of policy agenda. And I was curious then if you could relate that to what you are now calling the global police state. Are these to be understood in sequential historical terms, meaning that polyarchy was an overarching foreign policy concern from approximately the 1970s to 2001? Or has there been a real shift from kind of polyarchy to the global police state? In
Sure.
short, is the global police state a continuation of promoting polyarchy, or do you see these in deep tension with one another?
Sure, that's a great question. And I mean, the underlying focus here is modes of social control and domination in global society, how the ruling groups are able to challenge face up to challenges from below and reproduce their own domination and their own hegemony. So that book, Promoting Polyarchy, and the whole notion that the United States developed this whole industry for intervening in other countries in order to promote polyarchy, came out of the particular historical moment of the second half of the 20th century. And what was going on here is that the United States promoted authoritarian regimes and dictatorships in the face of the revolutionary movements, particularly the post-World War II period, culminating in the 1960s and the 1970s, anti-colonial movements, anti-imperialist movements, also third world nationalist movements. And the response of the United States and the other former colonial powers was to assure control in the face of these struggles that were really a threat to the system by imposing dictatorships, promoting and putting in power dictatorships, CIA coup d'etat, US military interventions, and authoritarian regimes. So then these dictatorships and authoritarian regimes had generated mass resistance, mass movements for democratization around the world. That's the historic moment of the 1970s, late 1960s, 1970s into the 1980s. And the these mass movements against dictatorships and authoritarian regimes were acquiring a revolutionary character. So again, that's why I was, when you asked me about methodology, I was emphasizing the dialectic, and especially when the dialectic of opposites and different struggles of opposites are these different modes of domination and resistance and how they shift and how they drive forward history. So the response of the United States, and not just the United States, it was also the leading capitalist powers, the leading core powers, was to say, okay, dictatorships and authoritarianism no longer do the trick. They don't do the trick because the mass opposition that they generate is leading to revolutions. And we did have a revolution in Iran. Of course, it went a different way later on that overthrew the Shah. And we had, most importantly, the Nicaraguan Revolution of 1979, that US clung to supporting Somoza right up until the end. And so the lesson for policymakers was, now we have to shift our modes of domination and control in the world capitalist system. So that's what led to this promotion of polyarchy. There's nothing transhistoric about it. There's nothing inevitable about it. There's no reason that those that control the international system would cling on to promoting polyarchy. It was a response to that particular historical moment. Having said that, and now before I link this to global police state and how the modalities of social control and domination are shifting towards fascism and global police state. Before I get to that in just a moment, let me say that there was a second aspect to my study on promoting polyarchy and my whole. So I was talking about promoting polyarchy, and there was a particular response of the ruling groups led by the United States, but the ruling groups in global society towards the mass movements against dictatorship and authoritarian regimes, and said that that was an historical moment and we're not in that moment anymore. But I wanted to add, though, that there's something else that came out of that whole strategy of promoting polyarchy, which is still very much in effect, and it's new modalities of US intervention here in the political processes of other countries. That continues, I mean, that goes before promoting polyarchy, and it's deepened extensively. And, you know, one of the things going on here is that as capitalist relations have spread all around the globe, there's a much more intensive rise of civil society, and therefore the battle for hegemony within civil society in and across countries has really intensified. So these new modalities of political intervention that I analyze in the books are still very much operative, and they're made possible by especially by the new forms of communication and new forms of political mobilization. But having said all of that, global capitalism is now in a deep crisis of legitimacy and of hegemony, and the polyarchic political systems around the world, that is the formally democratic political systems, are cracking up. They're facing this mass crisis of legitimacy and of hegemony. And the pendulum is swinging now back again from consensual domination to coercive domination. And so we're seeing actually a reversion to powers that be in the world capitalist system having to resort to authoritarianism, to dictatorship, and to global police state in order to contain actual and potential rebellion from below.
Jacob? Okay, so I know some critics have said, and I think misrepresenting your work in so doing, that you don't fully account for US imperialism. Could you explain how you understand the role of the US state in global processes of capitalist accumulation and in the global police state more specifically? And would you describe this as imperialist, and what is at stake in doing so or not?
Yeah, because there's big political stakes here, but I would say that I take my critics that have actually engaged with my work and then have serious critique on it. I take them very, very seriously, and I've modified a lot of my thinking in response to critics that are seriously engaging my work. But what I found is some critics haven't even read my work, or they simply dismiss it on orthodox or rhetorical grounds. And this is one of them. When I talk about imperialism, my critique of imperialism has been very clear, and there's two dimensions to it. And it is first that the classical theory of imperialism analyzed a world in which capitalist classes were organized nationally, and they were in competition with one another. So you had a British capitalist class, a US capitalist class, a German capitalist class, Japanese capitalist class, a French capitalist class, and these national capitalist classes were competing with one another. They were competing for markets worldwide. They were competing for access to resources worldwide in colonial and imperialist expansion. And they were competing for political control worldwide. And that, of course, is the analysis that led us, that analysis of the classical theory of imperialism is what led us to the First World War. And then again, the Second World War. And I have no problem with the classical theory of imperialism, but here is the thing. We have to remember that history is, all of these structures, all of these processes, history is constantly changing. And so it's not that the classical theory of imperialism was wrong, it's now outdated because capitalism has gone through fundamental processes of transformation throughout the 20th and accelerating in the 21st century. So the evidence that these national capitalist classes, the leading edge of these national capitalist classes, have transnationalized. And by transnationalization, I don't just mean that they now operate around the globe, although that too, but as they do so, they integrate across borders. And so you have a transnational capitalist class as the hegemonic fraction worldwide. And this is a class which does not belong to a particular nation state. The classical theory of imperialism said that these national capitalist classes utilized their own states in competition with other states. So those are my two. So that's my first critique: is the classical theory of imperialism is outdated because we need to see the rise of a transnational capital, a transnational capitalist class, which is a different political and international dynamic than we would have had in the first half of the 20th century. The second, my critique of the theory of imperialism is how we understand what the United States does in the world, or for that matter, what Great Britain does in the world. Now, what some of my critics say, again, the ones that haven't read anything I've written, that, you know, it becomes popular to maybe read a line or two that some second or third person has written and launch a critique, is that I dismiss US intervention. I mean, the brutal wars of US intervention and conquest in the Middle East, for instance, the US orchestration of a destabilizing campaign against Venezuela and Bolivia, everything we've associated with the interventionist dimensions of what we call imperialism are alive and kicking, and they're deepening, and they're just as dangerous as ever. But here is the thing, my analysis, and again, this is empirically driven. I found a lot of my critics never respond to my empirical basis of my argument. And I'll give you an example with a name in just a moment. But that what the US is doing around the world is intervening militarily, politically, economically, through sanctions, etc., in order to defend and promote the interests of global capitalism rather than any US national interests, and not in competition with the interests of the other leading capitalist powers, but in defending those interests. And I've given a vast wealth of both examples, hands-on examples, plus also data. I mean, if you've read my works, you're probably familiar with a few of these examples. The US invaded Iraq in 2003. And the vast majority of the left said that this was a intensification of inter-imperialist rivalry to keep out China and Russia and France, and those countries politically opposed that intervention. But the US occupation force immediately, still in 2003, announced after they had achieved what they call pacification, that Iraq was now open to business to investors from anywhere around the world. And that the very first two oil companies to come in and take advantage and seize Iraqi oil under the military canopy of the US occupation forces was the Chinese state oil company and Total. Total is a French public oil company. So that evidence suggests the United States didn't intervene in Iraq to keep out oil companies from other countries, but to invite them in and protect them, to open that up to transnational capital, including transnational oil companies. Another example I've pointed out, and again, we can go dozens of examples, is that in Argentina defaulted on its debt at the turn of the century, 2001, 2002, many of you remember the uprisings there. And then the US intervened, and the US Treasury Department together with the IMF. And the US did so in order to force the Argentinian state to pay back the bondholders. And many of those bondholders were from all over the world, including Argentine bondholders. And so what the US is doing there is defending the interests of transnational finance capital and the holders of bonds all over the world. And now let's just take the example of China. And of course, there's these geopolitical tensions between the US and China. They cannot be understated and underestimated, but we need to understand them in a different context. But what has been the US position, whether it was under Obama or whether it's now under Trump? The US has been demanding that China open up because China is only partially available to transnational capital. And so you have to have, until recently, I think this is just changing now, a transnational capital could only have a 49% interest in any Chinese-based corporate operations. And also the banking system is largely state, although that's changing extremely rapidly as well. And so US pressure on China has been to open up China, not particularly to end corporations based in the United States, but to the whole world. So I don't use the term imperialism only because when people hear it, they hear the classical theory of imperialism and they feel that the US is in rivalry with China and, with the UK or whatever. That's why I don't use the term. But if we mean by imperialism, this intervention, the mobilization of military, political, economic resources to intervene in the world, to suppress any challenges to global capitalism, to open up all of the resources and the labor in the world to the exploitation of global capitalism and so forth, then imperialism is live and kicking. I wanted to mention someone just, and I don't mind mentioning him because he's put me all over the internet. We had I had a forum where I wrote an article for something called Global Transitions Initiative. And so they publish once a month an essay on things we need to think about to transition away from this civilizational crisis. And then there, 5, 6 people respond. So the particular response was from Fred McDuff. He's the son of Harry McDuff, one of the founders of Monthly Review. And he responded, and then he posted it all over the internet, including our Monthly Review page, with the title, Capitalism is both national and imperialist, as if I'm saying capital is not imperialist. But when you read the response, there's a zero reference to any of my empirical or case study reference points that I just made to you. And that is generally the tenor of the criticism of those that say I ignore theories of imperialism. But I do want to conclude with one critical point here, that how we understand what we call imperialism has deep political implications for our struggles. Otherwise, it's just a mental exercise, right? Just an intellectual exercise. And so when we overemphasize this notion of an imperialist nation against former third world nations, we become blind to class formation and class contradictions and class struggles within each country that is attacked by what others call imperialism, what I call US intervention. Okay, so we're a bit blind to that. So then you get these positions that the BRICS, are a progressive challenge to world capitalism. And it's nothing, that could be nothing further from the truth when we actually study what the BRICS are proposing and what they're doing and what social and class groups are leading and controlling the BRICS countries. So we get the position which finally has changed now. But for many years, the African National Congress post-apartheid period was still some revolutionary force. So this misguided approach of imperialism papers over these transnational class formation and internal and transnational class contradictions. And so this becomes really significant politically. And I just conclude with, you can see right now this very dogmatic left, and I'm going to call myself a Marxist left, with regard to discussion around, for instance, Nicaragua or Bolivia right now. Now, Bolivia, the Mass and party of Evo Morales just came back to power, and any leftist anywhere in the world has to applaud that. That is fantastic that fascism was nipped in the butt there. But the mass social movements we're talking about people to the left of the MAS, and we're talking about the grassroots indigenous and peasant communities and workers in Bolivia, have been critical of the MAS government from the left. And they critically support the MAS coming back to power in this electoral conjuncture to defeat fascism. But you almost got instantly, that election was just a few days ago, it was just last week, but you instantly get the same ones that are saying imperialism, US imperialism against the rest of the world, against other countries, explains everything, now condemning this grassroots social movement left on the ground in Bolivia because they don't blindly support MAS with the view that MAS is and head-on confronting imperialism. So you see the political pitfalls of this weak understanding of the whole theme of imperialism. And I hope that helps my response.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's very helpful. One of the other things that we wanted to ask you about is your theorization of 21st century fascism, and more specifically, how exactly it relates to the global police state. Because in this most recent book, you say on the one hand that the new or neo-fascism or 21st century fascism is an aspect of the global police state, but then you seem to suggest that it could potentially take over the entire global police state. So I guess the question is, if the global police state seems to have been functioning more or less well for liberal representative democracies, under what conditions do you think the transnational capitalist class would likely shift to their mode of government being openly fascist?
Sure, but let me recall that what I mean by global police state are three things that, of course, come together, right? So one is the need that the need that the system has, or that the agents of the system have, to repress and control the mass of surplus humanity and the mass of poor and working people in the face of rising resistance worldwide. And of course, there's a weakness to that resistance because we don't have a worldwide left, but that's another discussion. Yeah. But that's one. The second is that global police state becomes immensely profitable in the face of chronic stagnation in the global economy and this crisis of overaccumulation. So, but the third dimension of global police state, because it's not global police state here and fascism there, it's part of this concept of global police state are political systems which increasingly we can characterize as what I call 21st century fascism. And I add the 21st century because there are a lot of similarities, but some distinctions with 20th century fascism. But so what we can say, if you do want to separate the discussion of neo-fascism from global police state, we can say that there's an elective affinity here between those that first dimension of global police state, the need to repress and control a rebellious global population at a time of acute crisis, an elective affinity with that, and the move, political systems which increasingly look like 21st century fascist, authoritarian, and fascist. So right now, the ruling groups worldwide are deeply divided, extremely divided, and this actually opens up space for those of us from below. But there is very limited support among both capitalist elite worldwide, but more significantly, the political agents of global capitalism in states and in political parties worldwide. There's minority support for a fascist or a neo-fascist solution to retaining control in the face of crisis. But that will change if and when mass rebellions from below actually come to threaten the system itself, to actually appear that they could overthrow global capitalism or could gain significant momentum to make a threat to the the domination of transnational capital. So here in the United States, and I don't know how many, if you have people from other countries zooming in right now, the United States, we're at the doorsteps of fascism. Hopefully it will be beaten back from November 3 and after, even with an attempt at an electoral coup d'etat and these neo-fascist paramilitary forces taking to the streets. But that's because right now, U.S. capitalism and global capitalism is not under serious threat. There's, prolonged political instability. There's rumblings from below. There's the crisis of legitimacy and hegemony. But should that change, many among the ruling groups will get on board with a 21st century fascist project. But that also leads to a different discussion than you're asking me about, and I won't go into it now, but I want to point out that the rise of 21st century fascism has to be understood in terms of a larger complex of what structurally is taking place, but also political and cultural movements and developments. And one of them is that that there is a social base for fascism in the 21st century, which is distinct from the 20th century social base. And I know a number of those zoomed in have read my book, so it's explicated in more detail there. But the flip side of that, of how space has been opened up for a 21st century fascist project, is the weakness of the left and the turn among, and I've criticized this and I know I'm going to be attacked for it, but that's okay. What I more recently have called the intellectual petty bourgeoisie, and the movement of what were organic intellectuals earlier in mass struggles and in leftist movements into academia and into non-governmental organizations, NGOs, who put forward a certain politics. Some people call them an identitarian politics. There's 1,000 different names for them, that don't really offer anything to the would-be social bases of 21st century fascism, and therefore allow those would-be social bases to be organized and recruited by 21st century fascist projects. And I know that's not what you asked me, but it's part of this larger story. But just to conclude, I think the rise of this 21st century fascist or authoritarian political systems is part of global police state. And I guess you were asking me, though, why wouldn't the liberal democracies be happy with global police state without having to get rid of liberal democracy? I guess I actually didn't answer that. So in a single nutshell, they will get rid of liberal democracy if there is really a threat to the system, and that we cannot defend that liberal democracy from below.
That's very helpful.
Yeah, thank you. So, you have written extensively about the militarized social control of immigrant workers and its multifaceted function in the global economy. Could you speak more about how the repression of immigrants figures into the expansion of the global police state and the normalization of authoritarian forms of social control, perhaps not only for immigrants, but for others as well? And could you talk about how you see this as related to the reconfiguration of racial and caste modes of labor control, like globalization? And finally, could you also speak to what you think the focal points, be they strategic or tactical, of the immigrant justice movement, what you think those should be?
Sure. I mean, that's also, a fantastic and incredible question that we could spend not just the hour and a half, but I think a whole
We'd love to.
Yeah, months
of
of critical theory workshops just on that. But so I'll try and be brief, but I also want to, because this is, I guess, part of your critical theory workshop series, and so we want to go a little bit into theory and a little bit into history as the context to bring it up to 2020, right? So I think we need to see that the way that capitalism has functioned over 500 plus years of its history, in addition to expanding outward and in addition to subordinating or constantly expanding the amount of the base for labor which can be controlled and exploited in the circuits of capitalism, has been to differentiate the mass of the laboring population worldwide. So, I mean, historically, there was the transatlantic slave trade and capitalist slavery in the Americas as a form of differentiating African labor groups and indigenous labor groups from other labor groups, from European origin labor groups, but differentiation for two purposes. One is super exploitation and super control of one sector of the mass of laboring peoples, whether it's through slavery or whether it's through other mechanisms. And the second has been to divide those laboring masses, which today is the global working class. So that's historically the role of racism, and it's again the larger project, and it's even pre-capitalist, but here we're talking about capitalism, how ruling groups differentiate those that are going to be controlled and exploited. And the differentiation during slavery and then during Jim Crow, to take the example of the United States, was a distinct civic status. So slaves were legally slaves. Later on, de jure was Jim Crow, but it was a distinct civic status in the practice. So as we get to the 21st century now, nation states, with a few exceptions around the world, of course, we got Palestine, but basically distinct civic status among a national population no longer exists. And so a new form of having a distinct civic status for the laboring masses is this division between citizen and immigrant, because immigrants are not citizens. So that is actually, you have here, for instance, in California, you have immigrant workers without undocumented, and you have citizen workers. And they're both workers, but once again, you see the mechanism of how capitalism differentiates the laboring masses in order to super exploit one sector. Immigrant workers are super exploited and super controlled because, of course, they're deportable. They don't have rights. They can be sent back to wherever if they get rowdy, go on strike, organize trade unions. That's exactly what happens. So we see how the mechanism of differentiating the exploited masses is reproduced, and now the system has a way to do it through a distinct civic status with transnational migrant labor that it can no longer do with Black labor or with racially oppressed communities in the United States or anywhere we look around the world. So this is the war against immigrants and the control of immigrant labor is a legitimate differentiation. But here's the other thing going on is that we have an increasingly globally integrated production, financial, and service system. And we have ever heightened levels of integration. And so we know that this is part of that story is new transnational flows of human beings. They've never been so intense, these flows back and forth and all around, than they are now. And that, you know, the figure here is 700 million migrant workers. Now that includes 300 million migrant workers who have crossed borders. And it includes another 400, which are migrant within their own countries. And so they might not have a different civic status, although in China they do. And you're talking about 200 million. In China, you know, there's the pass system. So if you come from the rural areas, you don't have the same rights in the urban areas on the East Coast. And therefore, it's as if you're a transnational migrant. So the thing is that the transnational capitalist class did not so much plan this, say one day, you know, let's recast racial control systems in order to make migrant labor and migrant control the new centerpiece of how we can super exploit and divide the working class globally. But those conditions simply presented themselves, which is why, you know, you're asking me about the polyarchy. And the thing is, I was analyzing the late 20th century and how that came about, the promotion of polyarchy. But the thing there is that we want to remember that we always want to do a concrete analysis of concrete conditions. And we always want to put those concrete analysis of concrete conditions within the historical context in which they emerge and in which there is a general and a particular or a universal, and how it looks particularly on the ground in different locations. So what I'm saying is that here is and I don't know if I'm talking, George, do we have time for me to expand a bit more on this? Okay, so let me give a concrete example, because I recently wrote an article together with a graduate student of mine, and it is about the movement against mass incarceration. And that's not my area. I've delved into criminology, criminalization, criminal justice, mass incarceration, because I was saying earlier, my methodology that I recommend for everyone is, even if we have our own specialization, mine is analyze capitalism and its crisis, right? Or Latin America. Even if we have our own specialization, we want to dabble a little bit in everything so we get the big picture and all of their connections. So, you know, what I found in studying, you know, the rise of mass incarceration that led me to this analysis, that the super exploited and super controlled sector in the US, were Chicanos in the Southwest, let's just put that aside for the moment, but in the rest of the country, Blacks. And again, with that distinct civic status, first through slavery and afterwards through Jim Crow, de jure. Distinct civic status, de facto distinct civic status. But with the civil rights movement and then the Black liberation movement and all of the dramatic transformations of the 60s and 70s, and with Black leadership in the most militant trade unions, such as the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, Black workers became not a good labor force for capital. They were no longer disciplined, quite politically militant, had voting rights and labor rights. And so there was a general move away from using Black labor, and instead, at a time when capitalist globalization is penetrating Mexico and Central America more than ever, generating displacement, migration to the United States. So it's not that transnational capitalist class said, let's, you know, use this new racial caste system of immigrants. It's rather that the conditions presented themselves for this transition. So you asked me then finally about the immigrant justice movement. And here I also want to give so my quick answer to that, and then I'll just explain why what's going on here, is that the vast majority of immigrants of migrants are workers, and particularly the lowest rungs of this transnational working class, without even the same rights as the other members of this transnational working class. So the immigrant justice movement needs to do several things. One is to identify that this not just an immigrant justice movement, but it's a movement for justice for immigrant workers, which is linked in turn then to the whole struggle of the working class. So we need to infuse this movement with a working class perspective, with a radical critique of capitalism perspective. And, there we get to the critique of the whole left in general, or the lack of a left at this particular conjuncture. But I do want to point out, and I'll conclude this question with this, and I know that there's older people, maybe my age or in between, listening, and so they remember this. And then there's probably younger ones that were too young, the millennials, or even after them, the Z generation. 2006 saw an uprising, an immigrant-led uprising here in the United States. I am here in Los Angeles, and we had first on March, I think it was March 28 of 2006, 1 million people in the streets of Los Angeles, led by immigrants and undocumented immigrants. 1 million people is the single biggest demonstration in the history of the Americas. And then on May 1st, we had 500,000 to 600,000. And it was totally peaceful, but that terrified the ruling groups, the powers that be. And so they realized that they had to now intensify a war against immigrants, and they had to restructure the whole policy and practice of using immigrant labor and forcing them underground, and have a totally different strategy. So we get to Obama and then Trump with this intensified war against immigrants. But a second thing happens. It's not just the caging up kids and the brutality of the immigrant detention centers and deportation regimes. It's all of that. But more significantly, and this was Obama, and Obama's no less our friend, no more our friend than any one of these other representatives of global capitalism. The strategy there was to take the immigrant rights movement, which at that point had a working class content, a militant content. I remember we had 3 demands: amnesty for all, no questions asked, amnesty for all, an end to all raids and deportations, and I forgot the last one, I forgot the last amendment. These 3 militant demands. So immediately the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Democratic Party, they all start massively supporting 50% of that movement, when the hegemony in that movement was the working class and the militant demands. The 50%, which was all moderate, was simply large for a lobby for a pathway to citizenship, massive funding to the moderate NGOs, which will take over the immigrant justice struggle and then marginalize the others. And that's exactly what happened. And that's how hegemony is reproduced. That's part of the story of promoting polyarchy and now NGOization. So to reinvigorate the immigrant justice movement, not just move beyond the moral critique but we have to link it to the larger issue of militant working class struggles. And we have to go back to those 3 demands. They're diluted.
Thank you so much, William. That's very helpful. Now, just in the interest of time, Jen and I still have 2 rather large questions about the fight back against the global police state, and I want to get to them. I'd also just like to encourage people, if those who are listening have questions that they want us to ask afterwards, don't hesitate to start formulating them and typing them into the chat. I will, just in the interest of having it on the board, formulate for everybody one of the questions, also because it points to the strengths of William's analysis, but I'm not going to ask for you to respond to it because I think it's going to be too big. And that is the extent to which you engage not only in an analysis of the formal economy, but also the informal economy, and how great your work is in demonstrating how the illegal political economy is a really central and driving force behind global capitalism. And so the overall question is, well, why is it that capitalism splits its economy between a formal and an informal sector? How is it, or why is it that there's always a gangster element to capitalism? That's a very, very big question. William, if you find a way of bringing it in, by all means, but I really want to get to our questions about the fight back. So one of the 2 questions that we had is whether or not the existence of socialistically oriented states, right? They might not be fully socialist, they might be open to a certain extent to global capitalism, nonetheless constitute significant sites of resistance, right? You write on page 129 of your book, for instance, that when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was an overnight drop of 50% in the GDP, a tenfold increase in poverty, and a spike of 75% in the mortality rate of workers. And we see this also happening in East, similar things happening in the former Eastern Bloc and elsewhere. So does this suggest that the socialistically oriented states, even if they've been deeply penetrated by global capitalism, are still preferable to those that have been completely opened up to capital? And in particular, we'd love to hear you more on China, which you referenced earlier, or other examples, Cuba, North Korea, Vietnam, etc.
Sure. Well, and again, a fantastic question and discussion that we need to have. But I don't think we can put Cuba and China together, and I'm going to explain exactly why, and that will be the segue into my response to what you're asking. But certainly countries like Venezuela, countries like Bolivia, and for that matter, Cuba, are challenges. They're partial resistance to global capitalism, just as you said. And I really don't know about North Korea. I don't know enough to speak about North Korea. But China and Cuba, we have to distinguish between those and then look at China here, because China is really too important to the whole global system, right? To not look at it more carefully here. So I don't see China as a resistance to global capitalism, but an alternative form of 21st century capitalism, right? An alternative form, an alternative model for global capitalism, which might become more and more popular post-pandemic, right? And as the US and the US Anglo-American model becomes less and less viable for the ruling groups worldwide, for the transnational capitalist class. But the Chinese Communist Party loves to say that they are implementing socialism with Chinese characteristics. And I don't think that's the case. I think rather that China is implementing capitalism with Chinese characteristics. So what do you see in China? You see a significant state sector, but you also see in China, and I'll come back to the state sector because it's not necessarily a socialist sector, but it's a state sector. But you see a capitalist class in China. You have more billionaires in China than you have in the United States. You see tens of thousands and more, rising very quickly, millionaires. You have acute inequality in China that rivals inequality anywhere else in the world, in Brazil and the United States. You have the law of value, is, to bring this out theoretically a bit, is operative in China and the whole Chinese economy. You have production, which increasingly is not for social need, but for private accumulation. You have the privatization, even though it's officially a public health system, there's, in all intents and purposes, there's also a private healthcare system. And even the public health system, people have to pay, and if you can't afford it, you die, just like the United States. So, I mean, I don't think you can see in any way that China is resisting global capitalism. Rather, it's putting forward a different model of global capitalism. We can call it a model of state capitalism in linkage with private non-state capitalism. If you look at the public sector in China, the state sector in China, first of all, it's cross-invested with private Chinese and transnational capital. That's the first thing. There's no single state capitalist firm, big capitalist state firm, which is not linked directly or mostly directly, but also indirectly with transnational corporations from outside of China and with big time Chinese capitalists. And again, they're driven by the law of value and by profit making. What you do have in China, which is an appealing model both for capitalists and also for us worldwide, is that the state plays a much greater role in regulating the market and in regulating capital. And of course, that's a little bit different than traditional, Fordist Keynesian regulatory capitalism that we had in the West, but not terribly different in that its actual function is to regulate capitalism, not to suppress or overthrow and move beyond capitalism. The other thing that the Chinese state is doing, and this might become in a post-pandemic an attractive model for the transnational capitalist class and global elites elsewhere, is that the state also mobilizes resources in order for the society itself to be reproduced in a way that no longer can US capitalism and neoliberal capitalism do. So infrastructure, China's on the cutting edge right now worldwide of infrastructure, and that is straight state financed and state driven. So that's a model that can perfectly be appealing to global capitalism more generally. And Chinese ability to control that pandemic with just a few thousand deaths and it's, virtually eradicated, again, shows the central role that the state could play in socialism under different circumstances, but this is not socialism, but rather it can also be show a model alternative type of global capitalism, which might be a little better than the global capitalism of neoliberalism, but that doesn't mean that we should support that rather than struggling against global capitalism. And that's not the case of Cuba. This is very important to see. Cuba does not have a capitalist class. There's not capital accumulation where individuals are accumulating capital. There's petty, small-time businesses. Now that might change. Cuba's rapidly integrating into global markets and into circuits of global capitalism. And what the Cuban government has tried to do, and it's not successful, and it won't be, is to have two separate sectors. Internally, a socialist sector in which the principle of socialist distribution, right, is operative, and egalitarianism. And then the external sector, which is tourism, and other things, is linked to global capitalism, and you have this external sector. And you can't have those two sectors because they're contradictory to each other, and they can't last. And the one that's going to lose here, unless there's dramatic new international environment that Cuba can insert itself into, obviously is what's left of its socialism. But I really want to emphasize this is not China because there's no capitalist class. But one final point here on this is that Cuba, for that matter, Venezuela, Bolivia, for that matter, China, there's no country that can remain outside of global capitalism. And once you do that, a structural power of transnational capital imposes itself, whether it's at a smaller scale in China because the country's so big and powerful, or a massive scale in any Latin American country that tries an alternative path. That structural power. So when a country like China, and I'll take this biggest example, even if you give them the benefit of the doubt, they're saying they're linking on to global capitalism to help raise the productive forces internally, so later on they could have a nice, good socialism. I don't think that's the case. But in any case, you're grabbing a tiger by the tail. And you're not pulling that tiger into your corner so you can achieve your goals. The tiger is pulling you into its corner of global capitalism, and with it, all of the transformation of social and class relations and power relations, and so forth. So, once again, we could talk forever about this, but that would be my initial response. I hope that's also making some sense. Probably raises more questions than it answers.
No, it was very helpful. Thank you. So I wanted to go back to something you talked about earlier. You were talking about the kind of weakness of the global left right now. And so in the final chapter of the Global Police State, you talk about some of the limitations of recent anti-systemic movements, as well as about the fraught relationships between movements and left parties. So what do you think have been the biggest weaknesses of and challenges facing anti-systemic movements in recent decades? And could you also talk about parties as well, and also elaborate on your critique of the history of Leninist vanguardism?
Sure. Well, let's talk with, I think there's three big weaknesses of any fight back against global capitalism, and they're all related to one another, but just for methodological purposes, I'll separate them momentarily. One is we actually don't have a so strong socialist left in most places around the world, much less here in the United States. Secondly is even where we do have a left that calls itself a socialist and exercises significant influence, such as the Mass in Bolivia or the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, we have this Leninist vanguardist model, which you just asked me about. So that's number two. And the third thing is we have a whole set of ideology and politics with class interests behind it, which is radical and leftist in language, but actually quite liberal and even conservative in practice. And that comes under all kinds of different names. I hate to use these labels because they mean different things to different people, but the identitarian paradigm, the multicultural diversity paradigm, the privilege theory paradigm, the settler colonialism paradigm, the critical race theory paradigm, which is nothing critical about it. But you clump all of them together. And again, they mean different things for different people. So I'd have to explain what I mean by all of that. But that's the third big weakness. It's those paradigms, this whole approach, this whole politics, which for me comes out of the intellectual and the political petty bourgeoisie, and backed by and pushed by the transnational capitalist class and its political agents. That is the third big weakness, because those paradigms are hegemonic. They exercise hegemony over this resistance from below. People start resisting from below, and the hegemony of these perspectives come into play. And then the resistance is diluted, weakened, and it's not really a threat. But let's start from the top. Lenin. So Lenin's model, the critique isn't so much here of Lenin. He played his historical role. He's dead for a century now. And he elaborated political practices which might have been very appropriate for facing the Tsarist dictatorship, right? But out of that, I think leftists suddenly turned that into Leninism, turns Lenin, insight for that moment in history into an ism. And and for me, that became vanguardism. And the approach of vanguardism is that there's a revolutionary party. Of course, it knows everything. It has the right answers, the right line, the right practices. And then that revolutionary vanguard party needs to take power in the state. But even if it doesn't take power in the state, it has a relationship with social movements and trade unions. And the relationship is the vanguard party defines what is going to be the political practice, what's going to be the political analysis, and says, now, trade unions have to follow that. We're the vanguard here. Social movements have to follow that. We're the vanguard here. So you have this vanguardism snuffs out mass initiative and control from below among social movements and among worker organizations. And again, we go back from history and we look empirically to see if this critique is correct, because it's not an intellectual critique. I said previously, Fred, what's his name? Fred McDuff writes off anything I say, but just because by fiat, he says it's not true, not because he's engaging with the empirical evidence or the historical evidence. So if we look back in history, my experience, I participated in the Nicaraguan Revolution, but across the board, this vanguardist model was eventually lost its social base, lost its ability to move forward because of the stifling control of the vanguardist model. So that model is bankrupt, and it's recognized pretty much around the world as bankrupt, but not in every place and not all the time. So what we need to think about for this fight back against global capitalism is a different model, and this is a three-way, as I put in the book for that matter, a three-way triangulation here between revolutionary political parties, whether they're in the state or not, the state and how we confront the state, participate in state electoral processes, align with liberal or progressive elements of ruling classes in the state. So there's the state, there's the revolutionary parties, and then there's the mass social movements, including the worker movements and worker organizations. And we need to rethink that three-way triangular relationship in which the social movements and worker organizations exercise complete autonomy from a party's telling them what to do. Rather, if a revolutionary political party is defending and pushing forward the struggle and joining in on these struggles, then fantastic. The role of the revolutionary party is to bring revolutionary ideology and revolutionary theory and to offer leadership to movements. But we see this with Brazil, Venezuela, and the other experiments of the left in Latin America, where the parties take power, such as in the case of Bolivia, and then so they're in the state. Transnational capital has tremendous structural power over these states, tremendous structural power. The states have no, as I mentioned previously with your previous question, the states have no other alternative but to integrate into global capitalism. You can't detach yourself. You can't have autarky in this age of globalized capitalism. But once it does that, once a revolutionary party is in the states, such as the Mass in Bolivia, tremendous structural pressure of transnational capital, global financial markets from outside. And how can the Mass in power in Bolivia, as an example of a leftist political party that in this case took power, how can it resist that pressure to continue to represent the interests of workers and peasants and indigenous below? The only way it can do that is there's a counter pressure coming from below, forcing Mass to represent its interests and not the interests of transnational capital from above, to use this one example. And in order for them to do that, these mass social and trade union and indigenous movements need to have complete autonomy to pressure the state and pull it in a different direction. And if you have this vanguardist model in which the vanguard says, no, stop your mobilization because you're affecting our program, then you have a serious problem. And the project is weakened. It's weakened because you lose mass support. It's weakened because you open up space for capital. So that's the first thing, this critique of the vanguardist model and the need for this new rethinking of a triangular relationship. The second thing is that we don't have a socialist left to begin with. We don't have it. The socialist left is an all-time weakness. We had these, of course, you had a mass socialist left arises worldwide in the late 1800s. In the anti-colonial struggle, the socialist and communist left plays a key role, especially in the revolutionary states of the former Third World. Of course, you have a powerful social and communist movements in the West and in the United States in the 1930s. You have still socialism and communist movements and Marxist-oriented mass movements that took inspiration from Marx, including the Black Panther Party, for instance. But then in the 60s and culminating in the 70s. But then you have the counteroffensive of neoliberalism and capitalist globalization. And as the ruling groups go global, they also want to reconstitute their class power. And that includes reconstituting political power and ideological and political hegemony. And so that means that the socialist left and working class movements have been at an all-time low, and we don't really even have their influence. We just had the mass uprising here, the George Floyd uprising, and there's almost a total absence of, and it's a shame because that uprising is now, what's left of the uprising is being co-opted. It's going nowhere. It's rudderless. And it's not the fault of the 25 to 30 million people, including myself here in LA, that we took to the streets. It's not the fault of these young people that are raring to become radicalized and confront the system. But there was no left, no socialist ideology, no radical critique, no linking the issue of police brutality to the issue of the capitalist state, to the to the whole bigger picture. And so we don't have that. But then that brings me to the third and final point here, which is the other thing is that the type of discourse, narrative, ideology, bombarding like those 25, 30 million people. Again, that's my critique. And this is where I know I get so many critics of me, but I don't care. I'm going to say all of this, by the intellectual petty bourgeoisie, which is in universities and which is in the leftist think tanks, but also the NGOs, and they make a professional career out of being in the NGOs. And of all of these narratives that I mentioned previously, call them whatever you want, you can put them under the general saying of identitarianism. And then the young people hear that, and they don't hear a critique of, the relationship of anti-racist struggles, for instance, to class and to capital. They don't hear that, and they do hear this identitarian nonsense, which is financed and funded to begin with by the transnational capitalist class through its foundations. After the Ferguson uprising here in 2015, tens of millions of dollars went to Black Lives Matter's organizations, not to the masses of poor Black people and Black working class people and all of us. It went to co-opt that and push it into this non-threatening lobbying and representational issues. And then right now, I mentioned that I wrote this article. I've never finished that little anecdote about the mass incarceration story. I think I forgot to. Let me do that. Then let me say how it's related to cooptation, and then I'll end. So I was finished because it's related now. I was saying with that story that the black super exploited, super controlled sector of the working class in the United States became undesirable labor for capital. And so they were pushed out and made structurally surplus labor, not all Blacks, but significant portion proportionally. And then in comes the immigrant labor, which is the new super exploited, super controlled sector. But then you have the problem that what do you do with surplus Black labor, which is potentially rebellious, and in fact is rebellious? Well, then you have to criminalize that labor. And so you have to create a system of mass incarceration, and that's part of global police state. But then the system of mass incarceration also becomes immensely profitable. But then here's the clincher here. So my graduate student and I are writing this article and discovering that starting really after 2008 and then accelerating in 2010, 11, 12, the movement against mass incarceration starts to have a radical critique and a mass character. The radical critique is abolition, and link this to why in the first place people are criminalized. And that's a threat to the system. So suddenly $100 million, that's the magical figure now that the foundations give to these movements. $100 million given to organizations dealing with a fight against mass incarceration. To the mild ones that are simply saying prison to higher education pipeline, teach them some classes in prison. When they get out, they can get higher education. Totally take off the agenda the radical abolitionist critique. And then those are marginalized. And then, of course, university professors teaching criminal justice have their narrative become hegemonic. So now we're seeing that again. Post-Ferguson, 2020, $100 million is going to issues of anti-racism, combating structural racism from Ford Foundation, from corporations, and which is why you see corporate CEOs taking the knee. The Democratic Party, which reproduces structural racism on a daily basis, taking the knee, because they're making this a non-threatening struggle. And to link all of these together, we don't have a socialist left with a viable model of working with mass social movements to combat that.
Go ahead. Oh, can I ask you as well? I don't see any questions in the chat yet, so I'd encourage people, if they have them, to put them there. But I'd love to follow up on this question of vanguardism for two reasons. One is that the way in which you describe vanguardism, it sounds like it would not be amenable to certain elements from the Marxist-Leninist and Maoist tradition, both in theory and in practice. In other words, that the vanguard would not be telling the masses what to do, but the vanguard would only have its power from the masses and only serve, to use the vocabulary that you used, as a kind of rudder to the masses, to bring organization to mass mobilization, not to crush movements. And so I'd be curious whether or not that more specific understanding of vanguardism would segue with your own interests, in part because the second part of the question is, when you refer to the triangulation of revolutionary parties, the state, and mass social movements, it seems that what you're suggesting is that the problem as of late has been that there have been mass social movements, if you take the case of the United States of the last few years, but there hasn't been a rudder for that, meaning that there hasn't been a party capable of, or parties capable of orchestrating the form of leadership that would be necessary to turn mass mobilization into real power. And so I'd love to just hear you a little bit more on this, because it almost sounds like you're going in that direction.
Oh, absolutely. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Okay.
That's what you're saying is precisely what I'm saying. And this clashes with orthodox traditional Marxist-Leninist Maoist political practice and conception of revolution. If you have vanguard with a small v, yeah, we need political vanguards in the sense that we need revolutionary political parties, right? And if what we mean by vanguard is that they bring revolutionary theory to the masses and give a rudder to these mass movements, then we need, vanguards. I would prefer not to use that language because it's been so misused. But what I'm saying is exactly what you just said. And without that, these mass movements, which we have burgeoning all over the world, I mean, look at the United States, but of course, just look at Chile, look at France, look at wherever you go around the world, they're burgeoning, and they're going to really, and the pandemic is going to mean even more so. It's going to intensify the push towards 21st century fascism, but it's also going to much more deepen this mass revolt. So more than ever, we need these rudders, and we need revolutionary theory and political organization. So I'm not. So I have, I can only agree with what you just said.
No, that's great. It's just, it was a little confusing to me, because in the triangulation that you mentioned of revolutionary party, state, and mass social movements, it seems that there isn't, at least a case that I know of, a mass social movement in and of itself that successfully established a sustained zone of resistance to capitalism in the same way that historically there have been political parties who have been able to do that. And so it just sounds like vanguardism with a small v, and that's, I guess, what I was looking for confirmation of.
Absolutely. That's the whole problem. I mean, look, we had the Arab Spring, we had, all of that uprising, but the most important, I won't say most important, but the most impactful in terms of what it could have been was in Egypt. And with this started arising spontaneously, but there was also worker organizations were involved. These longstanding social movements were involved. This mass uprising against Mubarak. This was 2011, right? And Mubarak was overthrown, but there was no the strategy was overthrow a dictatorship. It wasn't challenge what's behind this dictatorship, which is the capitalist class and the corrupt political elite in Egypt, in turn backed by transnational capital and its political representatives in the United States, right? There was none of that. It was just anti-dictatorial. And so that's exactly the tragedy of that just got us a year later back into even a more brutal dictatorship in Egypt, and even deeper neoliberalism and immiseration. So absolutely, we need, I want to repeat this as strong as possible if there was any doubt, we need revolutionary political organizations. Absolutely. And we need them to link with these mass social movements. Absolutely.
Thank you.
And if that does not happen, the social movements, one or another way, either they achieve mild reform at best, or completely co-opted, and you go back to what it was, or even worse, like Egypt.
Thank you.
And let me I just add one other thing there, but that's also where I don't want all this narrative of what I again call the intellectual petty bourgeoisie to get off the hook here, because they are not going to talk about capitalism. They're not going to talk about class, or if they do, it's just a little bit of income analysis. Some are rich, some are poor. They're going to push these narratives, which are really undermining our move towards a revolutionary critique of what's going on and towards the building of a left that can link with these mass social movements.
Very helpful.
Very helpful. Thank you. Just to follow up, we had a question. Sterling sent in some great questions. And so I just want to start with one of them that's a follow-up on your critique of Leninist vanguardist projects. And he wanted to know if this critique extends to, or if you'd have a separate critique of various Maoist projects occurring globally right now, such as in the Philippines or in India.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great and a challenging question. And I don't think you can combine those two, actually, just like, you can't say Cuba and China are the same as a, resistance to global capitalism. So I'm familiar with, and obviously we're not going to get into the critique, and I just noticed it's, we're nearing the end. So we can't get into a larger discussion of Maoism historically, the critique of it, and what it might offer us today. But I think, once again, it's a concrete analysis of concrete conditions, and the extent to which what we call Maoism or what we call Leninism or what we call Marxism is simply a flexible instrument to analyze the concrete struggle at concrete moments in history and to push those struggles forward, or if it is a doctrine with a rigid set of practices and orthodoxies. And so I really hesitant to speak about both those countries, except to say that in India, the Maoist movement has really been in the forefront of leading and working with communities in struggle. And in I forgot the name of the state where the Naxalites and others are so powerful, or at least were so powerful. But they are guided by Maoist ideology in was it Nepal, where they actually came to power, the Maoists? I'm sorry, I'm getting confused now. But anyway, what I am getting at is that I personally would engage in a debate and could have differences with Maoist thought and how useful it is to extract some principles from there and apply them to struggles around the world. But there's any social and mass struggles around the world, and they're linked with Maoist organizations that are contributing to those struggles, then that's fantastic. And that is the case in India. The Philippines is a little more complicated. I did spend some time in the Philippines, and again, I hesitate to make, a comment here that is not backed by a larger discussion. But the other thing is that in the Philippines, you had, and I haven't followed it recently since I was there 10 years ago, but I got quite in depth involved with, what's the name of the bomb? Gosh, I see now a moment of getting the name of the mass organization, Bayan, right? So you had Bayan with a strategy of mass struggles, not armed struggle. They didn't say, you and armed struggle are bad. They said our strategy right here is going to be mass struggle, in and out of the electoral system, in and outside of the political system. And the Maoist position was, no, you're undercutting our struggle, and actually targeted to be part of their target, Bayan's, mass movement. And so that was a very damaging Maoism. an example that if we're the vanguard and if you challenge us, you're our enemy too. But I don't know if you can reduce that to Maoism. That's again, this vanguardism. But just in summary, where I don't know if there's a revival of Maoism worldwide. I think you just have it in the Philippines and you have it in India in terms of mass struggles. And in China, you still have Maoism. Now it's called Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, Xi Jinpingism. But I mean, I think that's just because how the Chinese state legitimates itself and its own repressive system is by, glorifying Maoism, even though there's nothing. I think Mao would turn in his grave.
There was another question from the chat from Jamie, who was asking about the relationship between global warming and its devastating crises, and then the ongoing crisis of global capitalism, which you've written very poignantly about. He says, given the mass migration of refugees that has already begun to occur, do you think the police state model is a reaction to the changing climate, i.e. the capitalist class is already preparing for a world in which billions of people will face challenges to obtaining the basic necessities of life?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. The ecological crisis, global warming, and besides making this crisis existential, just even putting that aside, the environmental crisis is accelerating displacement, and it's accelerating all of these explosive social and political contradictions of global capitalism, and it's generating and will generate tens of millions of refugees and migrants in the coming years. And the ruling groups are acutely aware of that, acutely aware. And it's one of the reasons that they're developing these ever more sophisticated and dangerous systems of transnational social control and repression, including applying all of the technologies of global police state, but also thinking about how to spatially control and spatially reconfigure things. And the Pentagon released this report, which some of you might remember that report, in which they warned that over the next coming years, between now and 2050, there will be climate wars. I don't remember, but I think they even used that term, climate wars. So already the ruling groups are thinking about how global police state can be enhanced in order to contain the mass displacement and migration of tens of millions of people in the coming years. And that same Pentagon report declared that this is a national and global security threat, is global warming. But of course, the imperative that capital has to accumulate means that within capitalism, you cannot really resolve this environmental crisis. There's plenty to do. We can reform, we can push forward, but we need to see that it's capitalism itself which is going to destroy us ecologically.
Yeah.
I had another question. Well, let me ask, William, how are you on time? We're about an hour and a half in.
I'm fine myself, and I never got to respond to that issue on formal and informal economy. I'm fine. I have more time.
If you have something to say about that, I'd certainly be curious.
Sure. Well, I mean, the first thing is that the global working class is increasingly informalized. So, I mean, we've discussed that, and it's also in the book, all different forms of work, which is essentially informalized work, contingent, outsourced, part-time, temporary, Uber drivers that are considered entrepreneurs, or, the whole package there. So what we're seeing is that there never was this rigid dividing line between the formal and the informal economy. But under the new rounds of restructuring pushed forward by this fourth industrial revolution technologies, accelerated now under the pandemic, we're seeing that there's ever more blur between, like, the lines are ever more blurred between what's the informal economy and the formal economy. So we're seeing the informalization of global global capitalism, as I've always argued, and I think your question even incorporated this, this position of mine, that they're not split, they're not separate worlds, they're functionally integrated. But to the extent that we see this expansion of surplus humanity and global restructuring, more and more of humanity is inside the informal economy, and the informal economy is more and more the face of global capitalism rather than something on the margins of it. The data here, and I think I have the actual figure in the most recent book, is that 2 billion people are now in the informal economy. So if we have 7 billion on the planet, that's nearly a third of humanity. But if you talk about the 80% that are poor and working class, that's like what, 40%, 40–50% of humanity is moving into the informal sector. So here's the thing, in the informal economy, it's where now social reproduction takes place, number one. Number two, is where global police state is most intensively concentrated now. It's where the mass of humanity now has to turn for survival strategies, not just mafias and drug and sex trafficking rings, but have to turn to their survival strategies in the informal economy, where they can be criminalized, and therefore where that can become profitable for global police state. But also, let's remember this figure that the global drug trade, which is fully the illegal informal economy rather than the legal formal economy, right? There's just two levels of the informal economy. The illegal informal economy of the drug trade now generates, the latest figures I saw, is between $600 and $700 billion a year. And I think it's more. That was like a few years ago. And that goes into the global banking system, the global financial system. So this is an organic linkage in which these hundreds of billions of dollars are injected into the circuits of global finance. And then they're used for formal economic activity, accumulation, and so forth. But the other thing about the expansion of the informal sector, the legal informal sector and the illegal, because people have to turn to criminal activity as a survival strategy, right? So it allows the system to continue to push onto the informal economy, social reproduction. And of course, remember the logic of neoliberalism. Logic of neoliberalism is you privatize social reproduction, but you also eliminate social reproduction in the contract between the workers and the state, right? And the workers and capital. So this expanded informalization allows for pushing ever more the responsibility of social reproduction to the victims of global capitalism themselves inside this expanding informal sector.
Fantastic. Well, we had one other question. It might be the last, unless there are others that crop up in the chat, or if you want to say anything else. But Andrea was curious to hear you more on the lack of substance that you pointed out in the kind of critical race theory and the current civil rights movement, as well as the need for a socialist left, and what that means for the contemporary uprisings in the United States and more generally around the world, for that matter. So I was wondering if you could get a little bit more light on your position concerning, I guess the uprisings of the last summer in particular, and what a resolute socialist left could or potentially also has contributed to those movements.
Sure. Well, there was two parts to the question. Let me spend 1 minute on the first part, right? Why these, again, I'm just going to use these terms with, please remember all the time that they mean different things to different people. But everything that I clump under this term identitarianism, which again is in critical race theory and so forth. And I wouldn't even know where to begin to the critique, because we need a whole lot of time. But what's entirely absent from all of this, again, is class. Okay, and so whenever you bring up class and capitalism on university campuses, and in a lot of these NGOs, although they're better than the university campuses, you hear that, oh, that's class reductionist. And class reductionism is a serious problem. However, in my experience, 19 out of every 20 times that someone says, oh, that's class reductionism, that's simply, it's not class reductionism. And it's an excuse to ignore and remove class and capital from the discussion. And when you do that, you neuter all these mass movements, or at least how you claim to lead these mass movements. But there's much more than that. There's much more, because for instance, critical race theory, the big focus, besides the legal dimension in which critical race theory arose, but now it's not that, right? It's focused on interpersonal behavior and microaggressions. And if racism is not this larger structure, which is ultimately how the system exploits and controls a mass of racialized labor, but rather is interpersonal microaggressions, and rather is personal behavior modification. Look, right here at the University of California, we have a racial justice initiative across all the campuses. And what's coming out of it is, what's the solution here to achieve greater racial justice in the University of California is anti-bias training, as if racism is a matter of personal bias that requires personal behavior modification. And me and plenty of my colleagues and some of the radical students are not at all in agreement with that focus, but that's the types of focus that comes out of this. I mean, look at, privilege theory suggests that a white homeless person or a white, working class man or woman has some privilege over a middle class or professional or even Black bourgeoisie or, Latino politician. I mean, that whole critique. I don't even want to get into it all. It's too big to go into. But the other part of that question, gosh, I lost the main.
And the second, so yeah, one was the critical race theory, but then the other was just regarding the kind of current movement, the kind of Black liberation movement in the United States, and how it relates to the socialist left and the need for, as you were saying, a more kind of robust socialist left as a rudder for a lot of the uprisings.
Right. So I mean, the demand to there is no socialist left. So the demand was to, and it started out very militant. The demand is to defund the police, but then in a way you simply shift from one government age and then community policing. So the communities that are oppressed, that face police brutality, but behind, again, the police are simply the coercive arm of the state. They're the front line of what is a system which is intended to protect property from the property-less. Masses of people confront the police because those in corporate boardrooms and those in political office and those in foundation headquarters don't beat and kill Blacks, Latinos, and for that matter, poor whites. So what you see is the police in your neighborhoods and the neighborhoods of the propertyless elements, above all, of the working class and surplus humanity. And so the police seem to be your immediate and only enemy. But the police are, again, just that instrument. They might individually be racist and fascist, but they're just an instrument of this system and those that are behind the police. So it's fine to demand that the police be defunded. But and community policing, but community policing, you just say, okay, now members of the community will control the property list rather than, blue uniforms for police and so forth. So all of those demands, they come out of, a real grievances and real mass desire, but there's zero analysis of what policing represents. And if you want to attack police brutality, you have to attack the institution of the police, which means you have to identify property and the property list and who actually has power and who doesn't have power and the corporations that are behind the police and so forth. So none of that happens because there's no left putting that message out, and because the message going out is that's all we need. Take some police budgets and shift it to health and education, and let's do community policing of ourselves. So I mean that, but I want to, there's also both a Black, white, Latino, there's a radical left, which, not just me, and including those who are in the streets, which are critiquing this approach and warning about this co-optation. So it's out there, but it's drowned out because it's weak, because we don't have left political organizations in which those voices are heard. And it's drowned out by, in this particular case, the Black petty bourgeoisie, middle class, and professionals and politicians who simply want to neutralize this into greater diversity, meaning when you talk about greater diversity, what you mean is that there are more Black wealthy people and more Black corporate CEOs, so that you have a multicultural, multiracial boards of directors and more Black professionals and so forth. Sorry, you get me going on this, but we don't have time, so I fear it'll be misunderstood. But just to conclude, I think the key point is that there'll be a lot more of these mass uprisings, a lot more. We're moving into a crisis that we haven't seen in decades. And to the extent that all of these mass uprisings have tremendous potential, though that potential is not going to be realized if we don't have a left discourse and organization that can help give a rudder to these coming uprisings.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I think we're going to wrap up. Is there anything else that you wanted to add, William, in closing?
Well, thank you to you two, and so much for organizing this. And I guess those that are participating, I only see 3 or 4 people on the screen here. That's how Zoom works. Many of them are involved with the workshop and know that we were supposed to do this in person in April, but the pandemic made that not possible. So I'm so grateful to have the opportunity that we could do this by Zoom.
Well, thank you. They know we're very grateful. This has been absolutely fascinating, and if we look forward to reading this new article of yours. Is it out yet, or it's going to be coming out, or the one you were speaking about that you were working on mass incarceration?
That one should be out any moment. It's actually, these days I don't write too many journal articles. I prefer to write for mass communication, but this one is actually a shorter one for the journal Social Justice, quite a radical journal. But yes, we'll forward that on to you. Should be out any day.
Wonderful. We look forward to reading it. And thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to everybody who tuned in. Do you have anything else?
No, that's it. Thank you so much for taking the time, William. It was a real pleasure to speak with you, and I hope that all the listeners will explore your work in greater detail. It's an excellent and very important contribution to the contemporary moment. So thank you.
Thank you. All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye now.
Bye.